Series on oldies but goodies. As you see, our stage is coming around for us, and I have some original things up here. Like for instance, you may not be able to see it very well, but I have an original computer right here, right, and the automatic typewriter right here, and then beside that, I've got a Commodore 64, which if you don't know, nice, and then we have the original CDs on there on the back here, right? The records back there. And just some irons we got some great stuff that people brought in. And if you got anything else you want to add to this, I would like to keep building as we go through the series. That'd be great. But, oldies but goodies. And I mentioned last week when we talked about oldies but goodies and we started talking about, things from the Old Testament, stories from the Old Testament, well, they're all oldies but goodies, right? And we know that. But and last week we talked about Daniel and the lion's den, a story we're all familiar with. And a lot of the stories, most of the stories we're going to talk about are stories that we were all familiar with, right? Either from as childhood, growing up in church, maybe you just heard about them over the years. Because even if you don't go to church, you've heard of the majority of the stories that we're going to talk about. And today, of course, we're talking about Samson. And when you think of the story of Samson, what is some of the first things that come to mind? Somebody just yell out, Samson, strength, hair, long hair, Delilah, right? Yep. James, what'd you say? Honey. Good. We're going to talk about honey today. Thank you. If you don't know about that, you'll find out. Very good. James is a pastor's kid. You can tell right there. That's good. Yep. Samson got his eyes plucked out, right? After he got caught, too. A lot of stuff happens with Samson. We're going to go through a few things with Samson and just kind of see how even Samson's life and his adventures can apply to us. In fact, we sang a lot about grace today, and as we're talking about Samson's life, you're going to see a lot of grace reflected in Samson's life because, man, God kept giving him chance after chance after chance. He kept showing him grace when he didn't deserve it. And so we talk about Samson, and he's a guy who, in every sense of the word, was a then modern day superhero, right? He had the strength that no man could match. He was never defeated in battle. He was always. He was a ladies' man. He had everything going for him. If you look at it, he had all of it. And I talked last night to our Saturday night crowd, and I said, just to go ahead and further the idea that I am a nerd at heart, okay? So that you guys know, I've loved comic books my whole life, okay? I have a bunch of comic books still stored in my garage. I haven't bought one in a long time, but I have a whole bunch of comic books. And I read them growing up all the time. And in fact, at one time, I guarantee you I had some comic books that probably would have been worth some money, except that my mom, in cleaning out my room after I was in college, threw out a whole bunch of my comic books. So I blame her all the time for not having any money. It's her fault because that was my trust fund and she got rid of it, No, but comic books, and I love the whole idea of superheroes. My two favorite comic books are always Spider-Man. It's always been one of my favorites, and X-Men have always been one of my favorites. And so when all these movies came out later on, it was exciting to me. And I go see all the superhero movies. I like that. I like the action. I like the adventure. And quite frankly, I like the fantasy of it all, of someone with superpowers. In fact, if you were to have a choice in here, okay, you had a choice to choose any superpower that you would want. What's some of the superpowers you would want? Somebody just tell me some superpowers you would like. What's that? Flying. That's mine. I have it right here. Mine would be flight. Okay. What else? But flight like Superman, not flight like a fairy. Okay. I want a Superman. What'd you say? Eating? That's a superpower? Okay. I'm not sure what comic books you read, but all right. What else? Some other strength, super strength. Okay. What else? Speed. Yeah. X-ray vision. Yeah. Being invisible. That's right. I look at there's a lot of different superhero strengths out there, right? Superhero things. And we look at Samson, guys, and he had it going on for him at this time frame. We're going to go to the book of Judges, and we're going to actually read a lot out of the book of Judges, talking about Samson, starting with Judges chapter 13. And you can look in the Bibles around you with your Bible, or the verses will be on the screens. But when we talk about Samson, we're going to talk about 3 points of his life that really we can apply to us somewhat too. Because the very first thing we look at when we talk about Samson is today in our notes is this, is Samson's potential. See, Samson had a whole lot of potential in his life. Didn't always live up to his potential. In fact, he very often fell short of his potential. But he had a bunch of potential. And we've talked before about the Israelite people. And the Israelite people were continually getting themselves into trouble, right? I mean, they would do well for a while, then they would mess up, leave God, run away from God, and then what would happen? God would punish them, get them back in line by putting them in slavery, being conquered by a nation, being put into slavery. That's what would happen with them on a regular basis. Well, we look at them again, and they've messed up once again. And the Israelite people, because they've messed up, God now has brought in the Philistines to conquer them and to enslave them. And so here he is. We see Samson entering the scene out of Judges chapter 13. We go to verse 1, and we see again, it says again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. So what did he do? The Lord delivered them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. Now, a certain man of Zorah named Manoah from the clan of the Danites had a wife who was childless, unable to give birth. The angel of the Lord appeared to her and said, "You are barren and childless, but you are going to become pregnant and give birth to a son. Now see to it that you drink no wine or other fermented drink, and that you do not eat anything unclean. You will become pregnant and have a son whose head is never to be touched by a razor, because the boy is to be a Nazirite, dedicated to God from the womb. He will take the lead in delivering Israel from the hands of the Philistines." Man, right there you read, just in those few verses, God had huge plans for Samson. From the womb, he was preparing him to be a leader. His mother had to make sure that she was preparing her own body so that Samson was ready to be that leader, to be that Nazirite that they were talking about. Now, this was a time in Israel's history when they didn't have kings yet. They hadn't got to the point where they had any kind of that kind of monarchy or anything. No, what they had at this time was judges. People who were put into place, not voted in by the people. There was nothing like that going on. No, God placed someone in leadership. Put that man or that woman in leadership of the country, of Israel. Now, most of the time, the Israelites didn't even probably know who the judge was. This was just God putting someone in place to help direct the next step in Israelites' history. Samson was being trained to be that judge, to be that leader. Now, when you get to this point, you see that he's going to be a Nazirite. You go back to that verse, his mom had to do certain things because he was going to be a Nazirite. Now, there's this thing called the Nazirite vow that an Israelite would take and become a Nazirite. Now, the Nazirite vow contained a couple things. First of all, you could have no drinking of any kind of alcohol whatsoever. Nothing from the grape line at all. Couldn't drink anything along those lines. Not even grape juice or nothing. Nothing from that vine. No contact with anything unclean. So anything that had been dead, he could have no contact with it. Couldn't touch anything like that. And no haircuts. And these were just kind of a few of the rules that were to be met in order to be a successful Nazirite. And God appointed Samson as a Nazirite from the time he was in the womb. And these were a chosen people, a separated, consecrated person to be completely different than everybody else around them. And I'm not sure of all the reasons why that they had to do this as a Nazirite, but I think the main thing was so they could be different from the world. Set apart, somebody completely to be looked at as a unique individual. All right? That was Samson. That was the plan for his life. From the womb, that was the plan for his life. They needed someone, the Israelites, they were going to need someone powerful to protect them from the Philistines. Because the Philistines at this time had one of the greatest armies in existence. They had the greatest soldiers around. They were never defeated by anybody. Right? And so they understood one thing and one thing only, and that was power. That was it. They understood power and strength. That's what they understood. So God provides the Israelites with someone as a leader that had those characteristics. Samson, who he brought all these things to the table when it came to dealing with the Philistines. Someone they could respect. They could respect what Samson brought to the table. He had potential to do great things. I mean, you look at everything that's going on, God has set him up to succeed. That's what he's done. He has potential. And I'm a firm believer, guys, that everyone has that kind of potential. Everyone in this room has the potential to do great things for God. We all have that potential. God has not created us to be weak. He doesn't create losers. He doesn't create mistakes. Not one person in this room has God looked down and said, boy, I messed up on that one. He's not done that. Okay? No, He has created us to be full of potential. We all have that potential. And yet many of us never take advantage of that potential. In fact, some of us even smirk at the fact that, I could do anything for God. Well, whatever. And we decide we're not worthy enough to do that. We're not good enough. We don't have enough talents, enough skills. And then, so instead of doing anything new, we get into this routine of being in a routine. Just do the same old, same old. We come to church, we sing, we listen, we go home. We maybe even pray at our meals, and then we go on. Maybe we even open our Bibles and read it, but nothing ever changes our lives. It's just routine. And this relationship with Jesus has become routine. And routine can get you in trouble. There's a story told of two hunters who went up into the north, into the mountains to go hunting elk. And they had flown in, they were landed down in there, and they had 4 days to hunt. So 4 days later, the plane lands, and these guys have had some great success, these two hunters. And they had gone the year before and had good success. They went this year, had good success. They killed 6 elk. And there's 6 big elk. And so the pilot lands and says, hey, we can't take more than 4 elk. We can't do this. You're going to have to get rid of 2. The weight restrictions, we can't do it. And these guys started complaining to him. Well, they're saying, well, last year we had 6 elk. And we had 6 elk last year, and we left with 6 elk last year. So finally they complained enough, and the pilot said they finally agreed. So they all get on the plane, pile up, and within 100 feet of taking off, they crash. They can't take off anymore. And so they all climb out, and they're climbing out, and these two hunters look at one each other, and the one hunter says to the other, well, do you think you might know where we are? And he says, yeah, I'm pretty sure it's the same place we crashed last year. Routine will get you in trouble sometimes. And yet, we get into that state in our lives, and we get into routine. Or maybe even worse than that, we waste what God has given us. Right? He's given us so much potential, and we waste it by not doing anything. Now look, I know not everybody here is called to be a politician, thank goodness, but we are called to pray for our politicians, right? Not everybody in here can be a pro athlete, but yet I think we're still supposed to do our best, whether you're in a high school, middle school sport, or you're playing church softball. We should still do our best. And we're not all called to be pastors, but we're all called to be witnesses. We've all got potential. The idea is we can't waste what God has given us. That's the idea. Samson had potential, and he wasted his potential, as we know his story. The next thing we look at, though, is not only did he have potential, but then we see what got him in trouble. Samson's weaknesses. He had some weaknesses, right? He had some very childish tendencies. Samson, even as an adult, he wanted what he wanted, and he wanted it right then, right? That's how he acted all the time. He wanted his way. He would often act first and then think later, right? Anybody want to confess to ever acting first and thinking later in here this morning? Okay, right? We've all done it, right? Speak first, think later. All those things get us into trouble. Well, one of his weaknesses, first of all, he wanted a Philistine wife. Now realize, again, the Philistines were their rulers. They're the ones that enslaved the Israelite people. They're the enemies. And yet, Samson wanted a Philistine wife. We see in Judges chapter 14. What's going on here? Judges 14, we see in verse 1, it says, Samson, he went down to Timnah, and he saw there a young Philistine woman. When he returned, he said to his father and mother, I have seen a Philistine woman in Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife. Sounds like a child right there, doesn't it? His father and mother replied, isn't there an acceptable woman here among your own relatives or among all of our people? Must you go to the uncircumcised Philistines to get a wife? Look, this was not God's plan for him, right? It for sure wasn't his parents' plan. His parents looked at this idea of getting a Philistine wife and thought, this is ridiculous. That's not within our belief system. It sure isn't what our wishes are for you, but they go do it anyway. Samson's getting his way, okay? He's acting like a child, gets his way. So they decide to go down and meet this woman and prepare this wedding, this marriage. So on the way to meet this woman, we see in chapter 14, Samson kills a lion. So here's an exciting part of Samson's life. We see this a lot. It says in verse 5, Samson went down to Timnah together with his father and mother. Now, as they approached the vineyards of Timnah, suddenly a young lion came roaring toward them. It says the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him so that he tore the lion apart with his bare hands, as he might have torn a young goat. Now, I'm not sure, again, how you compare anything to tearing up a young goat, all right? That's not something in my idea, but he tore him up pretty easy, evidently, okay, this lion. It says but he didn't tell his father or his mother what he had done. Then they all went down, they talked with the woman, and he liked her, okay? So he didn't even talk to this woman yet. Before he just saw her, he said, man, I want her. Went home, told his parents, they went to meet him. Then he decided, yeah, I do like this woman, all right? So here they are. They're getting this. So we see his weaknesses. He's gone down, he's met the woman, and we see one of the very first weaknesses he has, and that's the opposite sex. It gets him in trouble. And we know the story of Delilah. We're going to visit a little bit. Women get him in trouble. Getting what he wants, no matter the consequences, gets him in trouble. All right? So later on the way back to be married, he's gone home. They've got this all set up. He's going back to Timnah to be married. This is where we see him wanting his own way, not worried about what everybody else says. We'll get to verse 8. It says sometime later, when he went back to marry her, it says he turned aside to look at the lion's carcass, the one he had torn apart, and in it he saw a swarm of bees and some honey. He scooped out the honey with his hands and ate as he went along. When he rejoined his parents, he gave them some, and they too ate it. But he did not tell them that he had taken the honey from the lion's carcass. Now go back to him being a Nazirite. What's one of the things he's not supposed to be doing? Touching anything unclean. He killed this animal. It's been dead for a while now. He goes in, he gets the honey out to eat it. He doesn't care about consequences. He just does what he wants to do when he wants to do it. That's a big problem here. So he then goes down to the wedding. And he gets married, and there's these guys that are at the wedding party, these 30 men, and they're Philistines. And he makes a challenge to them. He makes a bet with them. He gives them a riddle and says, if you can figure out this riddle, all right, then the bet is new clothes. 30 new clothes, 30 new sets of linens. You know, if I win, you get it for me. If I win, I'll get it for you. All right? And he gave him a riddle. And it says in verse 12, let me tell you a riddle, he says to these 30 men. If you can give me the answer within the 7 days of the feast, this party, 7 days after the wedding, he says, I'll give you 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes. If you can't tell me the answer, then you got to give me 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes. They said, tell us your riddle. Let's hear it. Now, I'm not going to get into the riddle and everything that has to do with the riddle and all the meanings behind the riddle. Just know that it has something to do with the lion he killed. Okay? This all comes into play here. All right? So he gives them this riddle. The guys 3 days in, they can't figure this riddle out. And they're getting nervous. They're getting upset. They're really upset. And they're angry that Samson is defeating them in this riddle. They know who Samson is. They know what he's done to other Philistines and warriors and stuff. And now they can't figure this out and they're angry. So they became desperate. You go to verse 14. Second part of verse 14 says, for 3 days they could not give the answer. On the fourth day, they said to Samson's wife, coax your husband into explaining the riddle for us, or we will burn you and your father's household to death. Did you invite us here to steal our property? Okay, so there's a threat. They got desperate. They threatened his wife and her entire family if she didn't do something to get the answer to this riddle. So what does she do? She pulls out the best womanly way to get something out of a man. She cries, right? Verse 16, then Samson's wife threw herself on him, sobbing, you hate me. You don't really love me. You've given my people a riddle, but you haven't told me the answer. He says, I haven't explained it to my father and mother, so why should I explain it to you? What'd she do? She cried the whole 7 days of the feast. This whole 7 days of partying, she cried, okay? So on the seventh day, he finally told her because she continued to press him. She, in turn, explained the riddle to her people. So now they know the answer. These guys know the answer, and Samson loses the bet. Verse 19 says, then the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. He's upset, okay? He went down to Ashkelon. He struck down 30 of their men, stripped them of everything, and gave their clothes to those who would explain the riddle. Burning with anger, he returned to his father's home. He goes back to the Israelite home. And then Samson's wife was given to one of his companions who had attended him at the feast. Look, man, Samson lost everything. He lost his temper, right? He loses his wife. He loses all of it. And in a fit of rage, he goes out to get revenge, and he kills 30 men to get the clothes, which is a continuation of more trouble to come. Because like a child, he didn't know how he acted out of anger. This was a weakness for him. And then when he finds out that his wife has been given to another, he wants vengeance and revenge, and we see him doing something else in Judges chapter 15. Verse 3, another story about Samson. Samson said to them, this time I have a right to get even with them, with the Philistines. Meaning that when he killed those 30 men, he didn't have a right, right? But this time I have the right. I will really harm them. So it says he went out and he caught 300 foxes, tied them tail to tail in pairs. He then fastened a torch to every pair of tails. He lit the torches and let the foxes loose in the standing grain of the Philistines. He burned up the shocks and standing grain together with the vineyards and the olive groves. When the Philistines asked who did this, they were told Samson, the Timonite's son-in-law, because his wife was given to his companion. So what did the Philistines do? They went up and burned her to death and her father to death. Same thing she'd been threatened with before, she still ended up getting it. Why? Because Samson couldn't control his anger, couldn't control his hormones, he couldn't control any of it. He had a lot of weaknesses. Like a child, again, who didn't get their way, he went out and acted out. And I think sometimes, guys, I think we act like this. I think we treat God the same way. We want something in our lives, and so we ask God for it, and we ask God for it, and sometimes we wear out the asking, but why, and now, but please, and God, but, and we sob and we cry, do all these things to God, and when He doesn't give it to us, we get mad at Him because He didn't give it what we wanted. And a lot of times, most of the time, it's because God knows what we need. We know what we want. God knows what we need. And we get ourselves into trouble because we can see this right here, right? We got this little spot we can see. That's all that Samson could see. He had a real focused little box he could see. What he wanted for me, that's all he wanted. It's all he worried about. And here's the thing. It's a good reminder for me. It's a good reminder for all of us, I think, this morning to realize this. And it's in your notes that God sees the big picture of our lives. We just see the Cliff Notes version of our lives, right? We see very limited scope of what's going on. God sees the big picture. He sees what's going to happen in our lives 10, 15, 20 years from now, and how the decision you make right now can affect that. And so when He comes along and says no to something, we don't even have a clue how that's going to affect us in our future. We just have to trust the fact that God sees the big picture. We can't see it all. Samson sure didn't see it all. All he could see was the right now, right here, what I want picture. That's all he could see. That's it. See, and then we see another time, we see that Samson is betrayed. Because now the Philistines come looking for him. His own people turn him in. His own Israelite people turn him in. So he gets upset. And we're not going to read the story, but in a fit of superhuman rage, he grabs the jawbone of a donkey, right? He goes to battle with 1,000 Philistine warriors, and he kills them all with just the jawbone. I mean, this guy had, again, go back to point 1, he had so much potential to do things. And yet the whole time, he's strained and doing his own thing because of these weaknesses. And then, of course, we come to the story we all know too, Samson and Delilah. Right? Delilah. And we're not going to spend, it's in Judges 16, and we're not going to spend a lot of time reading that story. But let's just recount the story. And you know what happened. He met Delilah. He fell in love again. He fell in lust, whatever it is he kept doing, right? And he goes and he's with Delilah, and she has been convinced to try to trick him into revealing where his strength comes from. We know, because we've been in church a while, his strength came from his hair. Him sticking with that Nazirite vow, his long hair gave him his strength. I'm not sure how that happened, but that's how it was working out, okay? So she goes to him, and 3 times she tries to trick him into revealing what it is that gives him the strength. And 3 times he tells her something. 3 times he lies to her. And every time he tells her something, he gets in a situation where the Philistines break in and try to capture him. Sooner or later, you would think he could figure this out, right? But no, one of his biggest weaknesses is what? The opposite sex. She has convinced him, no, that she didn't have anything what's going on. Well, finally, the 4th time, he tells her the truth, and we know what happens, right? She cuts his hair. They come in to capture him. He can't break loose again. They capture him. They capture him. They put him into slavery, put him into jail. They pluck his eyes out. He lost his strength. He lost his sight. He lost his freedom. He lost everything. Why? Because he had allowed the world, his weaknesses, the world around him, to dictate how he lived his life instead of God dictating how he lived his life. It's the world around him that influenced his decision-making, not God influencing his decision-making. And I think this is a tough challenge to all of us today, to not allow the world around us to influence us in how we decide how to live our lives, to direct even how we live our lives and how we make our decisions. One of my favorite verses in Romans chapter 12, verse 2. And it's a favorite verse of mine because it's a challenge to me on a regular basis. Because it says, do not conform to the pattern of this world. Don't conform to the pattern of this world. But it says instead, but be transformed, completely changed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will. And I think all of us, if we were to be honest, we would say we want God's perfect and pleasing will for our lives. His good. We want that for our lives. And yet the world around us influences us so much that we move away from that. And we still do our own thing, and those weaknesses come into play. So the third point I want to talk about then, we've seen his potential, right? We know his weaknesses, but let's look at how this applies to us. So Samson and us, okay? So how does this work with us? Because if we know the story, if we know the story, in the end of the story, we know that he wins. In a very tough way, he wins, all right? But if we look at Samson and us, and we look at how this can apply to us even so many thousands of years later, okay? We go to Judges 16. We go to verse 23. The last story of Samson's life. It says, now the rulers of the Philistines assembled to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to celebrate, saying this, our God has delivered Samson, our enemy, into our hands. Okay, when the people saw him, they praised their God, saying, our God has delivered our enemy into our hands, the one who laid waste our land and multiplied our slain. There's a party going on. Why? Because they caught their enemy Samson. There's a party. Huge party, as we'll see. It says in verse 25, while they were in high spirits, they shouted, bring out Samson to entertain us. So they called Samson out of the prison, and he performed for them. I'm not sure what he did to perform, but he performed for him. When they stood him among the pillars. So imagine this. We got this huge facility, this temple of Dagon, okay? And there's pillars. We're going to read in a second. There's a rooftop, kind of a roof patio, and they're all up in the patio party now after they made fun of Samson. It says in verse 26, Samson said to the servant who held his hand, hey, put me where I can feel the pillars that support the temple, so that I may lean against them. Now the temple was crowded with men and women. It says all the rulers of the Philistines were there. And on the roof were about 3,000 men and women watching Samson perform. Then Samson prayed. Now that's 3,000 on the roof. Who knows who else is amongst this whole facility here, okay? Then it says Samson prayed to the Lord, sovereign Lord. He's finally getting his act right at the very end. Remember me, please, God. Strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. Then Samson reached toward the 2 central pillars on which the temple stood, bracing himself against it, his right hand on the one, his left hand on the other, and Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. Then it says he pushed with all his might. His strength has come back, and down came the whole temple on the rulers and all the people in it. Thus he killed many more when he died than while he lived. Man, I mean, he ended strong. In a sad sort of way, right? But see, here's one of the biggest issues I think that Samson had his whole entire life. Samson had God in his life, but he wasn't godly. He had God, but he wasn't godly. And so many believers today, so many people who claim Christianity today, we kind of live the same way. I mean, we can see this very rampant in the churches of our country today. I mean, people walk into church with a relationship with Jesus Christ. There's a time where they ask Christ into their life, and it's a legitimate thing. But that's it. That's the only thing, the only time they acknowledge God. They may even walk into church and walk out, and they have God in their lives, but they're not godly. See, we look at their lives outside of church, and we see what we would call a very ungodly lifestyle. Because they do what they want to do, they say what they want to say, they look at what they want to look at, they buy what they want to buy. God never enters any of that because they have God, but they're not godly. See, I think part of the problem with trying to live this relationship with Jesus sometimes is that we want to have God as part of our life, but not necessarily in our life. Because if He's just a part, then we can take Him down, use Him, put Him back, and keep going. If He's in our lives, He's always there. See, sometimes that's a struggle for believers. We want to treat Him like a life jacket, right? We'll break it out and use it when we need Him, but then the rest of the time we'll just move Him from spot to spot as they get in our way, and eventually just put them underneath in storage somewhere so we don't have to mess with them anymore at all. That's kind of how we treat them. That's how Samson did it. I think he just kind of treated Jesus as when I can use them, God, I can use them, I'll use them. But when not, and when to put them away, when I want my own thing, I'll move God out of the way so I can get my own way. See, the life challenge for us in all this is to remember that knowing and living God are both equally important. See, a lot of us in here, we know God, but do we actually live God in our lives? Do people look at us when we walk into our neighborhoods or our homes or our jobs or the stores or our schools or wherever it is, and do they know that we're living God? Do we have a godly lifestyle, or do we just have God? See, I think both of those are important. To know and to live are both equally important. And so the challenge I want us to take away from Samson this morning is when we walk out of here today and we go into our workplace tomorrow is first of all to realize, man, we have a God that is full of grace. I mean, you look at Samson's life, and even at the end, God still showed him enough grace to let him be successful even in death. But I also don't want any of us to say, okay, I'll just wait till I'm back on my deathbed. Then I'll fix things up with God. All right? That is not what God wants us to do. He wants us to live our lives today the way He wants us to live our lives, not wait to the very end to figure this out. It took Samson a long time to figure it out. God doesn't want that for us. He wants us to not only know Him, but to live Him daily. So when we walk out of here tomorrow, we should be able to start applying our lives. How can we live for God today? How can we live for God in my workplace, and in my school place, and in my neighborhoods, and in my homes? How can we live for Him? How can people look at me and be affected by what God has done in my life? That's kind of where we need to go with this morning. That's the challenge. So with all that, do me a favor. If you bow your head and close your eyes for me. And let me just ask a question. And the worship team is going to come back up, and we're going to sing a song of invitation here in a second. But let me ask a question. How many, again, and I ask a lot of these kind of questions because I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. But how many in here today would say, Randy, yeah, there is some weaknesses in my life right now that are kind of dictating how I make decisions in my life. There's some weaknesses, some things that are probably not considered very godly, and those things sure influence the way I live my life, the decisions I make in my life. Pray for me this morning that I could move away from these weaknesses to strengthen my relationship with God so that these weaknesses are not into play anymore. Would you say, Randy, pray for me this morning as I deal with some of those things in my life? Would you raise your hand this morning?